Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, we're going to bounce around the garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina and show off some plants that are looking pretty good. We left the house for 3 weeks, went to a much warmer Florida, and while we were gone, real winter happened here in Raleigh. There were several nights down in the teens, which is pretty typical for a winter here. We will once a decade get something down in single digits or worse, but most of the time we're going to be somewhere in the teens during the winter time. So there was nothing really abnormal. The only thing is we're pushing the boundary with some plants, but a lot of the plants we were pushing the boundary with have now been in the ground long enough that they're able to resist some of that. And we'll see a couple of those things in this video. There's some rearranging coming up. We've talked about several times. There's a viburnum above my head up here that is going to be moving. We talked about it in another video recently, but this camellia is going to actually stay in place in all likelihood where it is. This is an interesting camellia species called handeli. So we're used to mostly Camellia sasanquas, which are typically fall blooming camellias, and then Camellia japonicas are very, very common, which mostly get quite large with the big, it's what a lot of people think of as camellias, big, giant, double flowers, variegated flowers, those kinds of things. Some of those actually bloom in the fall, and then there's a bunch of other species. Camellia sinensis is tea. So if you enjoy a cup of tea, or sweet tea, if you're in the South, or whatever kind of tea you enjoy, that is in a camellia plant. There's a new species, well, it's not a new species, it's been around forever, but we're going to see more of introduced over the next few years, and that's Camellia azalea. That's a species of camellia, which will be very confusing to people. And then this is one called handeli, and handeli is very interesting. It's got a narrow leaf, a narrow pointy leaf, as opposed to the big broad leaves that we think of on most camellia species. Really interesting foliage. It has kind of a weeping habit as it gets larger, and you can see that on some of the branches on even this small plant. What's amazing about this is it has much smaller flowers than some of those other camellia species that I just mentioned, but there's 2 buds on each axial. And so it ends up being incredibly showy. There's so many flower buds on this plant, and it's still forming them, if you can see that up ahead. So this can go on for a long time. If we get a night again down in the teens, it may kill these open flowers, but we're going to have more coming on it. So it's very long bloomed. Again, this is another plant that's adapted well to the space, because last year we had that freeze in December of 22, and it killed pretty much every bud on this plant. It was a much smaller, younger plant, and we got almost no flowers on it last year. And this year it's come into, its full potential. Well, probably not its full potential, actually, but the 16 degrees didn't bother it. 14 degrees the year before, it taken every bud off of it. So very, very interesting. Interesting species, definitely worth having. This variety is called snowbells, so it's Camellia handeli snowbells. Let's bounce around. It's a pretty frosty morning here in Raleigh, and you can see the hellebores just hanging over like this. We have a video coming out all about hellebores in the next few days. I've done a few videos in the past just on having put some hellebores in the ground as part of a tour video or something like that, and about cutting them back, a little bit of maintenance. But this one is just more of a kind of a general overview of hellebores in general and a lot of the hybrid hellebores that we have here in the garden. It's like 29 or something this morning. By lunchtime, this thing will be popped up and showing off so much color. So look forward to that video in the next couple days. This and about 3 other plants in the garden we figured for sure, if it got down into the teens, we'd see some damage on. And this is that Rosalinda Indian hawthorn, which we've tree formed. Had no cover on it, no protection, but here it is in year 3, and middle teens had no impact on it whatsoever. So I'm pretty thankful for that. There is a temperature that would hurt it. I've seen Indian hawthorns of all types, basically killed in a below 0 freeze we had many years ago. So, I expect that there'll be years that I'll have to cover it, but I now know that 16 is not that temperature. Okay, and so we can rest about that one. And the only reason that it matters so much is these flowers are just unique. They're pretty large for Indian hawthorn, medium pink flowers in clusters that are incredibly fragrant. And they're just they're absolutely amazing. And these are going to be, this year, every one of these terminal ends of these branches are absolutely full of buds. And so I think we're really going to be able to, hopefully, and you know, obviously things can change. It's still winter, right? Hopefully we'll be able to enjoy these flowers. One thing I noticed, and I'll bring this to Steph instead of Steph coming back here, is I've got a couple leaves back here that are damaged. I want to show this off real quick. We have a few plants in our garden that are enjoyed by leaf cutter bees. If you see this type of damage, this is a bee that comes in and takes a chunk out of that and then goes and lines, you know, their nest with it. I do not mind sharing, you know, something like this with a leaf cutter bee. A lot of times it's on red buds. They like big leaves like this that they can get in here and, you know, take a chunk out of. There's a few leaves on it that have this damage. It's just, you know, I got to, you know, I've said this in the past, you know, good, you know, our garden is part of nature, right? Our garden is, we've done something that has allowed another species to take advantage of a species that we added to our garden. So I kind of enjoy seeing this type of thing. One thing that's really showing off after this cold weather is this Rose's Blush blueberry. This is a blueberry that's native to the southeast. This is a named variety called Rose's Blush that turns this incredible color in the wintertime. It actually, when it's leafing out as well in the spring, it also has really great coloration. Flowers, it'll flower in just a few weeks, probably a little too early. You know, the blueberries tend to jump ahead like this, but it'll have small little dangling flowers on it, just like other blueberries. And then it's always showing off here in the garden. It looks great up against these chartreuse color plants. And then with this cold, this is another, when I say native, it's actually native to much further into the deep south. And so it could be a marginal plant here in our garden in Raleigh. But now that it's got a couple years under its belt, it's absolutely, completely hardy. It had no problem with the temperatures we've seen. And in fact, it actually colored it up more. And coming home to it, it was like one of the standouts here in the garden. Another thing that got damaged last year was our Distilium. So Distilium have just become wildly popular. 20 years ago, nobody knew what a Distilium was. And now every nursery that we visit seems to be 10% of what they're growing seems to be Distilium. And every commercial job that we go and see has some Distilium. Upright ones, low ones, you know, just so many of them being released. They're really are great ornamental plants, but they're zone 7 to 9 hardy, and definitely if you take that first winter and get a really hard freeze, you can potentially get a little bit of damage on them. Once they make it through that and they get themselves well established, you know, I haven't seen any cold damage on them at all on larger ones. But this cast in bronze Distilium from the Southern Living Plant Collection last year, it was just so new, and I didn't even think about covering it. I didn't think about it when we got that deep freeze in last winter. And it pretty much, it did a number on it, and it took a lot of the season for it to recover from that. And this winter, it's like winter didn't even happen. So just getting it established. These will get those little flowers. They're actually, you can see them budding up behind the leaf here. It'll be kind of a small little reddish flower. It's in that same family with Loropetalum, and it has that little frilly flower, but they're very small along the stems, but still very interesting. But then this one puts out all this kind of bronzy new growth after that. So it'll go through a lot of changes over the next 8 weeks or so, which will be pretty interesting. We didn't get to see that at all last year because it was just, you know, damaged by that first winter. It just happens. Our bulbs definitely got slowed down, and they needed to be slowed down. When we left the house 3.5 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, the bulbs were already up, you know, this high everywhere. And I really thought that we just wouldn't get hard. You know, I always say this, bulbs are tough. If they come out of the ground, they're not going to be a problem. But this was heading toward problem because they were already up this much before, and we had just had virtually no winter. But as long as they're only up about this much, they're able to take a lot of cold. Now, what you will notice, same thing as last year, some of the foliage did get damaged just a bit. That foliage is going to continue to elongate, and when this daffodil's in flower, there is going to be a little damage on that foliage next to it. That's life. It will happen. We are seeing depending on the sunlight, there are daffodils blooming in our area already. We did a lot of walking yesterday and saw that. This garden tends to have shade across it at some part of the day. And it keeps the soil a little bit cooler, slows things down a bit. And I think that's very, very helpful, especially when we're pushing the boundaries on things, to not have things jumping out too early. Sunnier areas, around the neighborhood, again, bulbs blooming already, things happening a little bit too early, loropetalum blooming, those kinds of things that I'd like to delay a little bit so that they don't get damaged by cold. One thing that was super nice to come home to was the osmanthus fragrans being back in bloom. It's supposed to be up towards 60 in the next few days, so we'll start to get the fragrance on it, but they're absolutely covered in flowers, small little white flowers that you have to get up really close to see, but they're incredibly fragrant. There's 3 of them on this border, which is the only thing I've used 3 of to create the screen over here with the neighbor, but it will be incredibly fragrant over the next few days. On a cold morning like this, you can see my breath. It's below freezing right now. We don't pick up the scent of the flowers, but again, as soon as it warms up in the afternoon, it'll fill the entire garden up with that fragrance. Down below that is an interesting plant. This is a Nandina, not an invasive Nandina. Nothing to worry, nothing to worry yourself about. It's a non-fruiting variety. This is actually a variegated variety of Nandina that turns red in the wintertime, just like firepower. So like firepower Nandinas are the ones you see as the flaming kind of red balls this time of year. This one's not getting as red as it should because it's not getting enough sunlight. These require some sunlight in order to get that as red as they can be. This is a variegated one called Atafuku. So after it greens back up, instead of being green under there, it's actually variegated under there, and really super interesting. But it's got to get out in a little bit more sun. It's been covered up by a few other things, and this is the first year in a few I'm seeing the firepower Nandinas really do what firepower Nandinas are supposed to do, and just be that flame engine red through the winter time. And look at ours. Our version of it is just, it's halfway there. It's not all the way there. And again, I think it needs a little bit of winter sun on it. Another one that definitely would have gotten damaged last year in the freeze if we hadn't covered it. I actually covered this Fats hedera. This year I did not cover it, and it's held up just fine in the two or three nights we've had down in the teens. Again, it's up against a wall. Going into a plant that's, marginally hardy in your area, or marginally hardy until established. Let's call it that, because that's true with a lot of the plants that I'm actually talking about. Having it up against a house is definitely beneficial. It's also, again, another area that's a little cold. This is on the west side of the foundation, and it's got a tree back here that blocks it later in the afternoon. And so I think the ground's staying cooler around its roots too, which is keeping it asleep, not jumping it ahead every time we get a 70-degree day and getting new growth on it. And it's winter. There's a couple leaves on it, I think, that'll end up falling off of it, but overall it looks great. I'll continue to stake this up on the porch over the course of this year, and I think it's really going to put on some growth. I'll be able to do whatever I want to with this. This is an ivy crossed with Fatsia, but it doesn't attach itself to things, so I don't have to worry about it destroying anything. It doesn't seed. It's not invasive. It's kind of the perfect tame plant to put on a structure like I'm doing with this one. Down below it, another plant that definitely in the first winter, if it had been in the ground and you get significant cold, would have been hurt. This is a Viburnum davidi, or David viburnum. Now that it's got some time under it, it looks absolutely fantastic. The leaves are curled down just a bit this morning. You'll see that when it's below freezing out, but as soon as it warms up, these leaves will perk right up. Lots of flower buds on it, so I'm very interested in getting open flowers on my David viburnum. Some of these viburnum will bloom so early that frost can damage them. But I had a person in Europe ask a question for the question and answer 2 weeks ago, if you saw that, about whether or not we grow David viburnum, and here's ours. We were out of town when that question got asked, so I wasn't able to actually show it, but it's looking pretty good. in its after it flowers here, after these flowers open up, hopefully we get to enjoy them. I will do a little bit of pruning on this one because I actually want to keep it somewhere in about the height it is and a little bit fuller than it currently is. As always, this beacon we put back here by the building, I should call this the beacon plant. This is the Florida Sunshine Alyssium. It is truly a beacon in this garden. If you look out the door, a window, anything, you look into this garden, this is the thing you're going to see from a distance. The stem color is beautiful on it. It's kind of a pinkish, red at times, but a little bit pinkish right now after some cold. The cold that you get on it, where it's, the leaves got, weren't real happy with it, actually made them even brighter. And so it's such a showy thing. It's the strangest growth habit I have on this thing, and I cut it last year to try to fill it out just a little bit more, but I continue to get a few stems that just want to go absolutely vertical and a few others that want to go flat to the ground. So I always have this gap here that I tried to solve last year with a little bit of top pruning, and I'm going to do it again. But it's super interesting. I haven't looked down there to see if it's multiple plants. Sometimes that can be that they have multiple plants in the pot. I don't remember when I had planted it, but it might be that. But this one, it's like a ground cover one, and this one's like a vertical fastigiate one. Which is kind of interesting. Another video we put up while we were out of town was a video on Cryptomeria, and this dragon prince Cryptomeria was one of the stars of that video. One of the first plants that was planted in this garden. It's just absolute zero maintenance plants. You keep weeds away from that thing, keep a little mulch around it. Once it's established, that's just how it looks. Perfect little mound that doesn't cause any issues, doesn't bother you in any way. You'll see a little bit of bronzing on it. We've had enough cold. We're kind of in the area in between where the Japanese cedars turn that bronzy color. So in a colder winter, you'll get more bronzing on it. In a, kind of average winter, they'll stay pretty green for us. But it's somewhere in between. It's got a little bit of bronzing in it. As soon as we get 8 days where it doesn't drop below freezing, all that bronzing will be gone and it'll be back to growing. It's really, really soft to the touch. We do have one of probably 500 daffodils that will go off in this garden over the next month. We have one open so far. One which was a little more mature, I'm sure. It's been in the ground a little longer and more buds on it. It had no damage. It's in a little more protected space, so there's no damage on the foliage on this one. But these are those little happy signs of spring, as Steph calls them. That she absolutely loves. This one is facing south, and so keep that in mind. I've mentioned before that most of the flowers on your daffodils, because the sun is, when they're blooming, the sun is still tracking across the south. It's moving east to west, of course, but it's tracking in the south, and the flowers will face south. And so we try to arrange these in the garden where they're going to be facing us and not away from us. If I put them on the south side of the property, the neighbor is going to be the one enjoying the flowers facing them. So this one's doing exactly what I talk about there. While we were on the road, we did a couple of videos in St. Augustine, Florida. One just bouncing around looking at different varieties, common varieties of plants that are used around there, and it went up on the main channel. And of course we spent 3 weeks down in Florida with palms everywhere, and they're so, it's identifying palms is just, for people that are, if I was down there for a little while for some stretch, I think I would be able to nail identifying all the various palms. But man, there are so many. Every single time I think I know them, there's some other palm that gets introduced to me while I'm down there. And we went to lots of gardens between St. Augustine and all the way down to the Keys. We went to several gardens. Just so many interesting things. But we get to come home to our windmill palm. Our Chinese windmill palm is looking good, and it took no damage at all at this point. These are well hardy in our area typically, but again, it's always about getting through that first winter, getting roots under them, getting them to that point where, we don't have to worry about them anymore. The first year it had a blanket tossed over it for a couple of nights, and this year haven't really thought about it. Didn't think it would get damaged, and of course it did not. Lots of growth coming out of the center of it. I think this is the year that we're really going to see this thing become the little corner piece for the porch that I had intended it to be. It just takes a long time. They're not the fastest growing things. They're not the fastest growing things, not the fastest thing to get themselves established where they can really start to to put on some growth, but I think it's finally ready for that. The other video from that St. Augustine trip went up on the Learn to Garden video series, and it's basically a tropical tour over at Flagler College. There's going to be a lot of tours on the Learn to Garden video series of different areas in the country and the ways that the plants can be arranged when we see something interesting as part of the design part of the Learn to Garden video series. And there's a discount code below every video if you're interested in purchasing the Learn to Garden video series. Thank you guys for following along. We have lots to do in this garden. We have been gone 3 out of the last 4.5 months or something like that. And it is definitely time. We're going to be here for a very long stretch, knocking some things out and getting some things checked off the list pretty quickly, I hope, this spring. So hopefully you're subscribed to follow along. Thanks for watching.